History tells us that humanity rose slowly, guided only by instinct, chance, and time. But what if that story is incomplete? What if the earliest records were not myths, but memories encoded in clay and symbol? What if the first cities did not emerge from chaos, but from instruction? Why do the oldest texts speak of beings who labored, argued, and engineered life itself? Why does creation appear not as a miracle, but as a solution to a problem? Why were humans shaped to work before they were taught to rule? Why do echoes of this story repeat across cultures separated by oceans and millennia? Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself, and let's dive in. The land between the rivers did not begin as a cradle for humanity. Long before fields were measured or cities named, the earth lay exposed beneath a brutal sun, shaped by wind and water alone. The Tigris and the Euphrates carved their slow paths through mud and silt, carrying life without witnesses. There were no kings, no temples, no voices raised in prayer. Yet, according to the oldest clay tablets ever pressed by human hands, the world was not empty. It was occupied, managed, and already burdened by labor. The texts describe a time so distant it resists intuition, measured not in years, but in vast cycles of time that stretch the imagination. In that age, the planet was claimed by beings who did not drift like spirits or symbolize natural forces. They arrived, established order, and set to work. They were called the Anunnaki, those who came down from the sky to the earth. Their presence was not poetic, it was administrative. Earth was a site, a colony, a place of extraction. At the top of their hierarchy stood Anu, remote and elevated, ruling from a distant celestial domain. His authority was absolute but indirect, exercised through command rather than touch. On the ground, power fractured into rivalry. Two brothers oversaw the mission, and their temperaments could not have been more different. Enlil governed the surface with discipline and suspicion, treating the world as a project that required order and enforcement. Enki ruled the depths and the waters, curious and inventive, drawn to the mechanisms beneath appearances, where matter could be altered and life reshaped. Their task was not symbolic stewardship. It was labor-intensive and exhausting. The tablets speak openly of why the Anunnaki came. Earth possessed gold, not as ornament or currency, but as a material with functional importance. It was needed, processed, refined, and transported. Extracting it demanded relentless physical effort, and for that purpose a lower class of beings was assigned to the work. These were the Igigi. The Igigi were not weak or insignificant. They were powerful in their own right, capable of intelligence and endurance far beyond anything humans would later possess. Yet they were subordinate, bound to the will of higher authority. For countless cycles they dug canals, drained marshes, and descended into the depths to tear metal from stone. The tablets do not soften the description. They speak of aching limbs, endless toil, and a growing anguish that no ritual could soothe. Time accumulated not gently, but like pressure. What began as duty became resentment. The rhythm of tools striking earth echoed day after day with no promise of release. The rivers were tamed, the land reshaped, the gold extracted. but the cost was borne by the same backs, generation after generation. Eventually, the Igigi reached a limit that hierarchy could not suppress. Their rebellion did not erupt in chaos. It arrived with grim clarity. One night, they burned their tools, destroying the symbols of their bondage. They marched together and surrounded the dwelling of Enlil, the mountain house that anchored authority on earth. Torches cut through the darkness, and the air filled with demands not for power, but for relief. The tablets describe shouting, tension, and a silence heavy with the possibility of divine war. Enlil responded with fear disguised as anger. He called for defenses, for weapons, for restraint enforced through violence. If the rebellion spread, the entire mission would collapse. Gold extraction would cease. Order would unravel. Faced with this crisis, the highest council was summoned. Anu descended to hear the case, and Enki was called from the deep. The confrontation revealed a rare moment of honesty among the gods. Anu did not deny the suffering of the workers. He acknowledged it. The burden was too heavy. The system, as designed, could not continue. Yet abandoning the work was not an option. The earth still needed to be managed, the resources still extracted. The question was not whether labor would continue, but who would perform it. It was Enki who offered the solution. And it was neither punishment nor compromise. It was creation. He proposed that a new being be fashioned, drawn from what already existed on earth, modified and elevated just enough to assume the workload. The creature would understand commands, manipulate tools, and reproduce independently. It would serve without challenging authority. This being was not imagined from nothing. Enki pointed to a primitive hominid already roaming the land, upright but limited, a product of natural evolution without higher cognition. By combining the material of the earth with the essence of the Anunnaki, he argued, a hybrid could be formed. Clay and divine blood, matter and intention. The proposal unsettled the council. To create life deliberately was to cross a threshold. It meant responsibility, unpredictability, and consequences that could not be fully calculated. Enlil hesitated, wary of granting any new being too much capacity. But the pressure of necessity outweighed caution. The rebellion had made one truth undeniable. The old system was finished. The decision was not framed as a miracle. It was framed as logistics. A workforce was required, and so one would be engineered. The fate of an entire species was sealed in what amounted to a labor dispute resolved through biological innovation. To carry out the plan, Enki turned to Ninhursag, the great mother and master of gestation. She understood the processes of birth, growth, and failure. Together they withdrew to a hidden place, a facility described as the House of Life, far from the scrutiny of the council. There, experimentation began. The tablets do not present this phase as smooth or triumphant. They record mistakes with brutal clarity. Early creations failed. Some could not survive. Others lived briefly but were malformed, unable to function, unable to work, unable to reproduce. The record speaks of blindness, weakness, instability, bodies that could not regulate themselves. Creation, in this account, was iterative and costly. Yet, even in failure, the texts reveal an unexpected restraint. These beings were not destroyed in rage. Each was assigned a role, a place, however limited. Life, once ignited, carried weight, even when flawed. Still, none of these forms met the original requirement. The Igigi remained idle, watching, waiting. The need persisted. Finally, a sacrifice was chosen. A god possessing intelligence and essence was selected so that his blood could be mixed with refined clay. This act bound divinity permanently to the new creation. Humanity would never be fully of the earth alone, nor fully of the sky. It would be divided by design. When the balance was achieved, when the mixture held, something unprecedented occurred. A being was born that could endure, comprehend, and obey. It breathed, it cried, it lived. The first functional human had arrived, not as a gift, but as a solution forged under pressure. Outside, the rivers continued their flow, unaware. The Igigi sensed release approaching. And within the stone walls of a hidden chamber, the future of the planet shifted, quietly and irrevocably, as clay learned to carry thought. The first successful human did not end the problem. It exposed it. One functioning body was meaningless against the scale of labor demanded by the world the Anunnaki had already reshaped. Canals stretched for miles. Marshes had to be drained continuously or reclaimed by water. Mines consumed workers at a rate no single birth could offset. Biology moved slowly, and the gods were not inclined to wait. The solution required multiplication, but not chaos. The new species had to reproduce, yet remain controllable. It had to spread across environments without diverging into something unpredictable. That tension shaped every decision that followed. What was created next was not simply humanity, but variation within humanity, introduced deliberately at the beginning rather than emerging accidentally over time. Ninhursag prepared the next phase with precision. The tablets describe measured portions of clay, not gathered at random, but selected, refined, and separated. 14 portions were formed, arranged with intention, 7 placed on one side, 7 on the other. Between them stood the mold of the successful prototype. This was not symbolism. It was process. Traditionally, these groupings have been read as male and female, the minimum requirement for sexual reproduction. But the language suggests something more structured. Each portion was treated individually, infused separately, adjusted in composition before gestation began. The implication is clear. These were not copies, they were variations. Different clays carried different properties. Clay drawn from riverbanks behaved differently from clay taken from deeper strata. Mineral content altered density, resilience, response to stress. When mixed with divine essence, those differences did not disappear. They amplified. What emerged were multiple foundational human lines, each tuned toward specific functions or conditions. Some were built for endurance. Their bodies were heavier, more compact, resistant to pressure and darkness. These were suited for the depths, for mining, for confined spaces where light barely reached. Others were shaped with lighter frames and heightened sensitivity, better adapted to surface labor, agriculture, and seasonal rhythms. Their hands were more dexterous, their coordination refined for repetitive but delicate work. There were those designed for proximity to the gods themselves, fewer in number, more refined in appearance, quicker in language acquisition, better suited for service within temples and administrative centers. They were intermediaries, not equals, but closer to authority than the rest. The hierarchy was built into flesh. Gestation did not occur in isolation. 14 lesser birth goddesses were summoned, each serving as a living matrix. The first generation of humans was carried not by humans, but by gods. Birth unfolded simultaneously, blood and pain multiplied across the chamber as life emerged in coordinated waves. The process was industrial and sacred at once. When the first generation matured, it happened rapidly. Growth cycles were accelerated. Childhood, as modern humans understand it, barely existed. Bodies strengthened quickly. Minds absorbed instruction with remarkable speed. Within a short span, the workforce stood ready. The Igigi were released. Their tools were discarded. Their rebellion ended not with victory, but with replacement. They did not return to labor. They returned to rest. Humanity entered the world as a substitute class, born into obligation without rebellion, because rebellion required time, memory, and the awareness of alternatives. Yet even as humanity expanded, limits were imposed. One capacity was deliberately withheld: longevity. The Anunnaki lived in spans that dwarfed human perception. Their biology was synchronized with cycles far longer than Earth's seasons. If humans had been granted similar duration, accumulation would have followed. Knowledge, resentment, ambition. Mortality was not a flaw. It was a control mechanism. Human cells were designed to age quickly. Growth surged, strength peaked early, decline followed. Death returned bodies to clay, preventing generational buildup of power. The mind could imagine eternity. The body could not reach it. This fracture became permanent, a source of longing and anxiety woven into human consciousness. Once deployed, humans were moved to Eden, a managed region optimized for productivity. It was not a paradise. It was a workplace. Tools were issued, tasks assigned, fields planted, canals maintained. At first, the system functioned flawlessly. Output increased, order stabilized. The gods were fed, supplied, and satisfied. But reproduction changed everything. Humans were allowed to breed without divine intervention. It reduced dependence on birth goddesses and increased efficiency. It also introduced unpredictability. Population grew faster than anticipated. Settlements expanded. Noise increased. Noise in the texts does not mean sound alone. It signifies disturbance, emotional volatility, conflict, desire, the resonance of many wills colliding in limited space. To Enlil, this was intolerable. Governance required silence, predictability, clean lines of command. Humanity was becoming turbulent. Enki observed differently. He saw adaptation. He saw creativity emerging from limitation. Humans learned beyond instruction. They experimented, combined skills, shared stories. Culture began to form, unplanned and unregulated. The first tension between creator and creation surfaced here. Humanity was no longer just labor. It was behavior. And behavior could not be fully engineered. Attempts were made to correct the imbalance. Disease was introduced, thinning populations without destroying infrastructure. When that failed, drought followed. Each time, Enki intervened indirectly, providing knowledge to select individuals who learned how to survive, how to redirect worship, how to manipulate conditions just enough to endure. This pattern established a dangerous precedent. Humans learned that survival did not depend solely on obedience. It depended on insight, on listening, on choosing whom to trust. As generations passed, boundaries blurred. Humans moved beyond assigned regions. Variations interbred. Physical distinctions softened, but behavioral differences persisted. The initial design began to erode under the pressure of life itself. Among these humans, certain individuals stood out, not because they were stronger, but because they were receptive. Enki selected them carefully, teaching language, ritual, measurement, and memory. One such figure would soon change everything, not by labor, but by knowledge. The experiment was advancing beyond its original parameters. The gods had solved a labor problem and created a civilization in the process. What they had not solved was what happens when a tool begins to understand itself. The clay had learned not only to work, but to question. And that question, once formed, could not be unmade. The shift did not announce itself with fire or thunder. It arrived quietly, through instruction. Humanity had been created to follow, but a small number were taught to understand. This distinction mattered more than strength or numbers. It marked the moment when labor became learning, and obedience began to blur into agency. Among the early cities, one stood apart. It rose near the meeting of fresh water and salt, where rivers loosened into marsh, and the land breathed slowly beneath the sky. Eridu was not merely a settlement. It was a point of contact. Here, Enki established his domain, and here, a human unlike the others was shaped with intention. His name was Adapa. Adapa was not a prototype of flesh, but of role. He was selected, trained, and positioned close to the god who valued insight over force. Unlike the miners or farmers, Adapa worked within the temple complex. He observed patterns, learned ritual speech, memorized cycles of stars and tides. He was taught how to listen, how to record, how to anticipate. The texts describe him as wise, but wisdom in this context did not mean philosophy. It meant operational understanding. Adapa knew when to plant and when to wait, when to speak and when to remain silent. He understood the behavior of water, wind, and human temperament. He served Enki daily, providing offerings, maintaining order, and absorbing knowledge not meant for mass distribution. This education altered him. His mind expanded beyond immediate need. He could imagine consequence. He could connect events across time. And with that capacity came power. The incident that followed was small in scale, but vast in implication. One day Adapa took a boat onto the water to fish, fulfilling a routine duty. The wind rose unexpectedly, violent and directional, a southern force capable of overturning vessels and destroying harvests. His boat capsized. He was thrown into the water, humiliated and endangered. Adapa did not respond as humans were designed to respond. He did not pray. He did not endure. He spoke. Using words taught by Enki, words that functioned as more than sound, Adapa addressed the wind itself. He cursed it. He commanded it to cease. The tablets record that the wind's wing was broken, that its force vanished. For 7 days, the air remained still. The world noticed. In the celestial realm, this absence triggered alarm. Wind patterns were not decorative. They regulated climate, movement, balance. When Anu was informed that the southern wind had failed, the explanation stunned him. A human had done this. A being of clay had interfered with planetary systems. Anu ordered Adapa brought before him. This ascent is described in language that resists literal interpretation, but implies movement beyond the surface. Adapa passed through gates guarded by beings who tested him, not physically, but socially. He demonstrated humility, knowledge of protocol, and emotional intelligence. These traits disarmed suspicion. He was granted access to the highest authority. Before Adapa departed, Enki intervened. His warning was specific. When offered food, do not eat. When offered water, do not drink. Accept garments and oil, but refuse sustenance. Enki framed this as protection, claiming the offerings would bring death. Adapa obeyed without hesitation. When he stood before Anu, the encounter unfolded differently than expected. Anu was not enraged. He was curious. He questioned Adapa, listened to his explanation, and laughed, not mockingly, but with recognition. Enki's creation had exceeded design. A human had acted with divine competence. Anu decided to reward this achievement. He ordered the bread of life and the water of life brought forward. These were not metaphors. They represented the mechanism of longevity, the extension of biological cycles beyond human limitation. Immortality was offered freely. Adapa refused. He followed Enki's instructions precisely. He declined both bread and water. He accepted the garments, anointed himself with oil, and stood waiting. Anu was stunned. When he realized what had occurred, his reaction was not anger, but sorrow. Adapa had been misled. The food and water were not poison. They were opportunity. By refusing them, Adapa confirmed humanity's condition: intelligence without duration, capability without permanence. Anu dismissed him. Adapa returned to Earth unchanged in body, but permanently altered in consequence. The chance for immortality had passed, not just for him, but for the species he represented. The decision set a boundary that would never be crossed again. Enki's motives remain debated within the text. Some portray him as protective, believing immortality would burden humans beyond endurance. Others see calculation. A human who could live forever would eventually rival the gods. Mortality preserved hierarchy. What matters is outcome. Humanity gained knowledge but lost eternity. Adapa became a model. He returned to Eridu with authority, wisdom, and the legitimacy of having stood before the highest power. From this point, humans were no longer only workers. They were administrators, priests, intermediaries. Kingship emerged. The tablets mark this transition clearly. After this moment, rule descended to Earth. Leadership was no longer assigned arbitrarily. It was taught, structured, and reinforced by divine instruction. Cities expanded under human management, guided by laws, measurements, and ritual order. Civilization accelerated. But with acceleration came accumulation. Population grew. Cities multiplied. Human noise intensified, not just as sound, but as presence. Desire expanded. Conflict followed. Humanity had crossed from tool to system, from solution to variable. The gods had solved one problem and created another. What began as a controlled experiment had produced a species capable of learning faster than its creators anticipated. The question was no longer how to use humanity, but how to contain it. The answer would not be gentle. Order followed Adapa's return, but it was not peace. Civilization expanded with a speed that unsettled its architects. The first cities rose not as organic clusters of dwellings, but as planned centers, aligned with waterways, measured by standardized units, governed by ritual calendars. Humans learned to count harvests, record transactions, and mark time by the movement of stars. What had been taught to a few spread outward, copied and adapted until knowledge could no longer be contained within temple walls. The gods had given humanity tools, but tools multiply themselves once placed in many hands. Writing preserved memory. Agriculture stabilized food. Surplus freed some humans from labor and allowed specialization. Artisans emerged. Scribes emerged. Priests emerged. With them came hierarchy among humans, mirroring the hierarchy of the gods who ruled above. The ancient lists describe this era as the time when kingship descended from the sky. This was not a metaphor for divine favor. It was a transfer of administrative authority. Certain humans were elevated, trained to manage others, to collect tribute, to maintain order in the absence of constant divine oversight. These kings ruled for spans that appear impossible by modern standards, tens of thousands of years according to the tablets. Whether these figures were hybrids, symbolic measurements, or rulers operating under a different temporal system, the message is consistent. Power was concentrated, and it endured. Cities multiplied across the land. Eridu remained sacred, but others rose to prominence, each assigned a function within the broader system. One became a center of metalwork, where ores were smelted and shaped. Another served as a hub of justice, aligned with solar cycles and law. Another focused on healing, housing knowledge of plants, anatomy, and recovery. Civilization unfolded as a distributed network, not a single capital. For a time, the arrangement worked. Humans labored. Gods received offerings. The balance appeared stable. But stability, once achieved, encouraged growth. Population increased beyond projections. Settlements expanded beyond designated zones. Fields pushed outward. Forests fell. Noise rose again. The concept of noise returned as a central concern. It was not simply the sound of voices or tools. It was the unpredictability of human behavior, disputes, violence, desire unchecked by design. Humans argued, competed, loved, betrayed, and mourned. They dreamed beyond instruction. They acted without permission. To Enlil, this was failure. Humanity had been created to reduce burden, not introduce complexity. The gods required order to function, and the swelling presence of humans disrupted that order. Sleep was disturbed. Ritual timing was affected. Authority felt diluted by sheer numbers. The first corrective measure was subtle. Disease was introduced, selective and localized. Illness spread through crowded cities, thinning populations without dismantling infrastructure. Panic followed, but so did adaptation. Humans learned which plants eased fever, which practices reduced spread. Knowledge circulated faster than expected. When disease failed to achieve lasting reduction, environmental pressure followed. Rain was withheld. Rivers fell. Crops withered. Hunger stalked the cities. Social structures strained as scarcity replaced abundance. Parents abandoned children. Communities fractured. Again, humanity survived. Enki's influence was visible beneath the surface. He did not openly defy decrees, but he exploited gaps. He communicated through dreams, through intermediaries, through indirect instruction. Certain humans learned where water could be released, how to redirect flows, how to endure lean cycles. Each survival deepened human resilience. To Enlil, this was sabotage. The experiment was slipping beyond control, not because humans were strong, but because they were adaptable. Adaptation was not something the original design accounted for fully. As tensions rose among the gods, another boundary began to erode. Some of the younger Anunnaki, stationed on Earth for extended periods, began to integrate too closely with the human population. Proximity bred familiarity. Familiarity bred desire. Unions formed between gods and human women. From these unions came offspring unlike either parent. Larger, stronger, longer lived than ordinary humans, yet still mortal. These beings became leaders, warriors, heroes. They dominated early societies, their mixed heritage granting them authority that seemed both natural and terrifying. Hierarchy blurred further. To Enlil, this development was intolerable. The separation between creator and creation was dissolving. Control, already strained, was breaking. The original solution to a labor problem had evolved into a world crowded with variables. The council was called again. This time, compromise was not discussed. Incremental correction had failed. Disease, drought, and regulation had not restored silence. The conclusion reached was final. The system would be reset. Humanity would be erased, not selectively, but completely. The method chosen was water. Water had once given life. It would now reclaim it. The plan was comprehensive, targeting surface and depth, city and field. The gods swore an oath of secrecy. No human was to be warned. The end would arrive without preparation. Among the gods, only Enki hesitated. Bound by oath, yet unwilling to annihilate his creation, he searched for a loophole. He found one in language. Rather than speaking directly to a human, Enki spoke to a wall. He addressed the structure of a house made of reeds, describing what was to come, detailing instructions as if giving commentary to inanimate matter. On the other side of that wall lived a man named Ziusudra, a ruler known for attentiveness and loyalty. Ziusudra heard everything. The instructions were precise. Build a vessel, seal it, make its dimensions equal in length and width, divide it into levels, coat it with bitumen until no water could enter. Bring aboard the seed of life. This vessel was not a ship meant to sail. It was a container meant to survive. A sealed structure designed to endure chaos rather than navigate it. Ziusudra obeyed. Construction began under the guise of ritual departure. The city assisted, unaware of what approached. Feasts were held. Tools rang. The sky remained clear until the final moment. When the signal came, Ziusudra entered the vessel and sealed the door. The world outside changed abruptly. Rain fell not as nourishment, but as force. Waters rose beyond memory. Cities vanished beneath waves. Humanity drowned in the element that had once sustained it. The vessel endured. For days without count, it was thrown and battered, sealed away from light and horizon. When the waters finally receded, silence replaced noise. The earth lay stripped, empty, reset. Humanity had survived, but only barely, and nothing would ever return to the way it had been before. When the waters withdrew, they did not reveal a healed world. They revealed absence. Land re-emerged flattened and raw, stripped of boundaries, memory erased beneath layers of silt. Rivers had forgotten their courses. Cities that once anchored civilization were reduced to invisible outlines buried under mud. The sky returned to blue, indifferent to what had been lost. Inside the sealed vessel, time had collapsed into sensation. There had been no horizon, no rhythm of day or night, only motion and confinement. Breath condensed on walls. Animals, whether flesh or preserved seed, waited in silence. Ziusudra endured not as a hero, but as a custodian of continuity, suspended between annihilation and rebirth. When the vessel finally grounded, it did so without ceremony. The impact was dull, final. For a long while, nothing happened. Then a hatch opened. Light entered, harsh and cleansing. Air carried a smell unknown to those who had lived before the flood, a mixture of wet stone, decay, and possibility. Ziusudra stepped into a world that no longer recognized him. He did not rebuild immediately. The first act was not construction, but acknowledgement. An altar was raised from stone pulled directly from the exposed earth. Offerings burned. Smoke rose straight into the sky, unbroken by wind. The gods noticed. For the first time since the flood began, the Anunnaki gathered openly. Hunger had returned them to awareness. Without humans, offerings had ceased. The ritual economy that sustained their presence had collapsed. The destruction they ordered had deprived them of what they required to function in this world. When Enlil saw the survivor, anger surged again. The decree had been absolute. No human was meant to endure. Accusation turned immediately toward Enki, whose reputation for clever defiance preceded him. Enki did not deny responsibility. He reframed it. He argued not for disobedience, but for correction. The punishment had exceeded necessity. Humanity had been excessive, but not irredeemable. The survival of Ziusudra proved something the council had ignored. Life, once capable of adaptation, resists erasure. The debate ended not in consensus, but in fatigue. The world was empty. The gods were hungry. Erasure could not be undone. Adjustment was the only remaining option. Ziusudra was summoned. He and his companion were brought before the assembly. There, an exception was made. They were granted longevity, removed from the cycle imposed on their species. This was not forgiveness. It was containment. They would live apart, beyond ordinary human reach, preserved as a boundary marker rather than a precedent. For the rest of humanity, new limits were imposed. Population control became law, not moral, but biological. Lifespans shortened further. Fertility became inconsistent. Infant mortality increased. Certain women were designated for ritual celibacy. Disease became endemic rather than episodic. Suffering was normalized as regulation. These measures were not framed as punishment. They were safeguards. The gods sought quiet. They sought sustainability. Humanity was permitted to continue, but never again to swell unchecked. Reconstruction began slowly. Survivors scattered across the land, drawn together by memory and instinct. The old cities were avoided at first, their buried remains treated as cursed ground. New settlements rose cautiously, smaller and less ambitious. Kingship returned, but altered. Authority no longer walked openly among the people. The gods withdrew to elevated spaces, temples that required ascent. Ziggurats rose not as monuments, but as barriers, controlling access. Interaction became formal, ritualized, distant. Human culture adapted. Stories of the flood became warnings. Water acquired symbolic weight, feared and revered. Storms triggered instinctive dread. Memory of destruction imprinted itself deeply, not as detail, but as anxiety. Over time, confidence returned. Fields expanded again. Trade routes reopened. Language diversified. The unity that once bound humanity fractured into regions and dialects. Difference replaced uniformity. This fragmentation was tolerated. Diversity created noise, but also division. A divided humanity could not act as one. That lesson had been learned. Yet ambition persisted. In the plains where rebuilding advanced most quickly, humans attempted something unprecedented. Rather than waiting for the gods to descend, they attempted ascent. A structure rose, layer by layer, aligned toward the sky. Its purpose was not shelter. It was connection. The intent was clear. If the gods would not return, humanity would reach them. This act triggered immediate response. Unified effort signaled renewed risk. Language itself became a liability. Communication allowed coordination. Coordination allowed challenge. The solution was precise. Language was fractured. Understanding collapsed. Workers could no longer coordinate. The project halted not through violence, but confusion. Humanity dispersed, carrying fragments of a shared origin into divergent futures. From that point forward, history accelerated unevenly. Some regions advanced quickly, others stalled. Memory of the gods faded into myth, then into symbol. The Anunnaki receded further, no longer present as managers, only as distant authorities invoked through ritual. What remained was inheritance. Humanity carried within it the design choices made at creation. The urge to build, the fear of excess, the tension between obedience and curiosity, mortality pressing against a mind capable of imagining eternity. The flood had not erased humanity's purpose, it had refined it. Labor became survival. Knowledge became legacy. Questioning became dangerous but unavoidable. The world continued, shaped not by divine command alone, but by the consequences of choices made long before the first city was named. The clay had been altered once. It would not return to its original state. From this point onward, history would be written by those who forgot the terms of their creation, yet lived by them every day. After the flood, the world entered a quieter age, but it was not a simpler one. The silence the gods desired did not come from peace, it came from distance. Humanity rebuilt without direct supervision, guided by memory rather than presence. The Anunnaki no longer walked openly among their creation. They watched from afar, intervening only when balance threatened to collapse again. This withdrawal changed everything. When gods are near, obedience is immediate. When they are distant, interpretation fills the gap. Humans began to argue not only with one another, but with ideas of what the gods wanted. Rituals diversified, laws shifted, authority fractured into local forms. Kings still claimed divine legitimacy, but that legitimacy now passed through priests, symbols, and stories instead of direct command. The post-flood cities grew cautiously at first, then confidently. Kush rose as a new center, marked in the records as the place where kingship descended again. This second descent was not a return to the old order. It was a compromise. Humanity would govern itself, but within boundaries enforced through belief rather than constant force. Agriculture stabilized, tools improved. Writing evolved from simple accounting into narrative. Humans began to record not just what they had, but what they remembered. The flood became a dividing line, a before and after etched into collective identity. Survival was no longer assumed. It was earned. As memory of the gods faded into abstraction, new power structures emerged. Priests became intermediaries, not because they spoke to gods, but because they interpreted silence. They read omens, tracked stars, preserved ritual calendars. Control shifted from raw authority to information. This transition carried risk. Knowledge, once centralized, now circulated. Humans learned from humans. Innovation accelerated beyond original projections. Metallurgy advanced. Architecture grew ambitious again. The urge to rise, to build upward, returned. The Anunnaki observed with concern. The flood had reduced numbers, but not ambition. Humanity had learned restraint, but not submission. The core design flaw persisted. Intelligence adapted faster than control mechanisms could compensate. Rather than destroy again, the gods chose fragmentation. Language, once unified, was allowed to diverge rapidly. Dialects hardened into barriers. Communication failed across regions. Cooperation diminished. Large-scale coordination became difficult. Humanity spread outward, carrying pieces of shared knowledge, but losing the ability to act as a single body. This dispersion reshaped culture. Myths diverged. Gods acquired different names, faces, and functions. What had once been a centralized system fractured into pantheons. The same entities were remembered differently depending on distance and time. Enki became a trickster in some regions, a savior in others. Enlil was remembered as judge, tyrant, or distant sky father. Ninhursag shifted between mother, healer, and earth itself. Memory reorganized itself around need. Humans no longer understood that these figures had once argued, negotiated, and compromised like administrators. They became absolutes. Symbols replaced personalities. Complexity simplified into doctrine. Yet traces remained. Certain bloodlines retained unusual longevity. Certain families produced rulers with disproportionate authority. Certain cities advanced faster than others. These anomalies were not random. They were residual effects of earlier intervention, diluted but persistent. Trade reconnected regions slowly. Ideas leaked across boundaries. Mathematics, astronomy, and law developed independently, echoing shared origins without explicit coordination. Humanity was reinventing fragments of what had once been given directly. The gods tolerated this development. Fragmented progress posed less risk than unified ascent. Innovation contained within borders could be monitored. The danger lay not in advancement itself, but in convergence. Still, curiosity persisted. Humans continued to look upward. The stars remained unchanged, indifferent markers of cycles larger than human lives. Observatories were built, calendars refined. Time was measured with increasing precision. This precision reintroduced an old tension. As humans learned to predict eclipses, seasons, and planetary movement, the gap between human understanding and divine authority narrowed. Knowledge reduced fear. Reduced fear invited challenge. Enki watched with conflicted interest. He had always favored insight, even when it complicated order. Enlil watched with tightening restraint. He had tolerated survival. He would not tolerate equivalence. Rather than erase knowledge, limits were introduced subtly. Certain discoveries stalled. Certain technologies failed to progress beyond thresholds. Materials proved insufficient. Techniques plateaued. Progress slowed not because humans lacked intelligence, but because paths forward narrowed. Humans interpreted these limits as natural. They did not see constraint. They saw mystery. Religion adapted to preserve distance. The gods became moral arbiters rather than engineers. Ethics replaced instruction. Obedience was framed as virtue rather than necessity. Control shifted inward. Human suffering continued, but it was now explained through narrative. Famine became punishment. Disease became trial. Mortality became meaning. The mechanisms of regulation were hidden beneath layers of belief. Generations passed. The memory of direct creation faded into legend. Humanity forgot that it had been designed. It believed itself chosen instead. This belief proved more durable than obedience ever had. The Anunnaki achieved what they had failed to engineer biologically. Self-regulation. Humans limited themselves through culture, law, and fear of the unseen. The system stabilized without constant intervention. But stability carried cost. The price was uncertainty. Without clear origin, humanity searched endlessly for purpose. Mortality pressed harder without explanation. The mind retained capacity for eternity, but no longer knew why. The experiment had reached a new phase. Humans were no longer tools nor threats. They were inheritors of a structure they did not fully understand, living inside rules set by absent architects. The clay remembered the hands that shaped it, even when the names were lost. As generations passed, The distance between humanity and its makers transformed absence into authority. What could no longer be seen could no longer be questioned directly. The gods became principles rather than presences, invoked through ritual instead of conversation. In that distance, power shifted again, this time entirely within human hands. Kings no longer ruled because a god stood beside them. They ruled because lineage, law, and memory said they should. Temples preserved calendars and sacrifices, but governance moved outward into councils, courts, and armies. Human systems matured, not in defiance of divine order, but because divine order had retreated. War emerged as a defining feature of this new age. With resources finite and populations unevenly distributed, conflict became inevitable. Cities fortified themselves. Weapons evolved from tools of hunting into instruments of dominance. Bronze replaced stone. Strategy replaced brute force. The human capacity for organization turned inward, no longer directed solely at labor, but at competition. The gods watched carefully. Conflict reduced population without requiring intervention. It redirected ambition away from the heavens and towards the earth. As long as humans fought one another, they posed no unified threat above. Yet war carried consequences the architects had not fully predicted. It accelerated innovation. Metallurgy advanced rapidly under the pressure of survival. Logistics improved. Communication systems expanded to support armies and administration. Humans learned to mobilize at scale, coordinating thousands through signals, symbols, and command hierarchies. The same skills once used to dig canals were now used to conquer land. Religion adapted again. Gods became patrons of cities and armies. Victory was framed as favor, defeat as neglect. The divine became partisan, divided along human lines. This fragmentation served the original purpose. A divided pantheon could never rally a united humanity. But beneath surface division, deeper patterns persisted. The oldest myths did not disappear. They sank. Stories of creation, flood, and descent survived in altered forms, reshaped by language and region, but carrying the same structural memory. Clay tablets cracked and broke, but their narratives echoed orally, woven into epics and law codes. Certain humans continued to stand apart, not kings, but observers. Scribes who noticed inconsistencies, astronomers who tracked patterns that predated their own cultures, healers who recognized that illness followed rules, not whims. These individuals did not challenge the gods openly. They questioned silently. Knowledge accumulated in fragments. The gods tolerated this as long as it remained fragmented. What they feared was synthesis, a single framework that could unite observation, memory, and inference into understanding. That threshold had not yet been crossed. Meanwhile, humanity expanded geographically. Groups migrated into harsher climates, adapting physically and socially. Skin darkened or lightened. Bodies adjusted to altitude, cold, and scarcity. These changes were later framed as destiny or difference, but they were consequences of dispersion engineered long before. The original variations introduced at creation echoed faintly through these adaptations, reinforced by environment rather than design. Humanity diversified without losing its core structure. Mortality remained constant. Curiosity intensified. As cities rose and fell, records grew more sophisticated. Laws were carved into stone, declaring order permanent even as rulers changed. Time was segmented into reigns, eras, dynasties. History itself became a tool, shaping identity and legitimacy. At the same time, fear persisted. Storms still carried dread. Floodplains were treated with respect bordering on terror. Water retained its dual meaning, giver and destroyer. Memory of the Great Reset had not vanished. It had been inherited as instinct. In private, some priests whispered of an age before kings, before division, when humanity spoke one language and labored together. These whispers were tolerated as nostalgia, not recognized as threat. Unity was remembered as myth, not blueprint. The Anunnaki maintained distance, but not indifference. They adjusted subtly. Certain leaders fell unexpectedly. Certain projects failed without explanation. The line between chance and correction blurred. Humans interpreted these events as fate. What neither side acknowledged fully was that dependence had reversed. The gods still required offerings, attention, and relevance to persist within human consciousness. Without worship, their presence thinned. Power shifted again, not through rebellion, but through neglect. As centuries accumulated, some gods faded entirely, remembered only as names etched into broken stone. Others transformed, absorbed into new religions, given new stories, new moral frameworks. Identity changed, function remained. The original hierarchy dissolved into abstraction. Humanity now governed itself within constraints it believed natural. Mortality, suffering, ambition, fear. These were no longer seen as imposed, but intrinsic. The design had succeeded in one crucial way. Humans internalized their limits, yet internalization did not extinguish desire. It refined it. The question of origin persisted, even when unspoken. Humans continued to ask where they came from, why they differed, why they died. Answers multiplied, none definitive. Creation myths diverged, converged, contradicted. Truth became layered. In this environment, the next transformation began quietly. Not through gods, not through kings, but through accumulation of understanding. Piece by piece, humans assembled frameworks that did not rely on divine explanation. Mathematics described motion. Medicine explained illness. Law replaced decree. The gods had stepped back to preserve control. In doing so, they had created space. And in that space, humanity learned to think without permission. Thinking without permission did not arrive as rebellion, it arrived as method. Humans did not announce a break from divine authority. They simply began solving problems without invoking it. Observation replaced appeal. Measurement replaced ritual. The gods were still named, but increasingly as symbols rather than causes. This shift unfolded unevenly. In some regions, tradition held tight, binding law to omen and fate to sacrifice. In others, necessity forced experimentation. Floods returned in smaller cycles, droughts came and went, and survival depended less on prayer than preparation. Storage systems improved. Irrigation became predictive. Calendars grew precise enough to anticipate scarcity rather than react to it. With prediction came confidence. Confidence altered social structure. Leaders were chosen not only for lineage, but for competence. Administrators rose alongside warriors. Accountants held power equal to generals. Writing, once a sacred function, became administrative infrastructure. Records were copied, archived, compared. Memory became external, stable, transferable. The gods watched the spread of this stability with unease. Stability did not threaten them directly, but it reduced dependence. When humans could explain outcomes through cause and effect, divine favor lost urgency. Offerings became habit rather than necessity. Religion adapted again. The gods became guarantors of morality rather than mechanics. They judged behavior, not harvests. Sin replaced imbalance. Salvation replaced appeasement. Control moved inward, into conscience. This internalization was effective. Humans policed themselves through belief, even as belief grew abstract. The gods no longer needed to intervene because humans enforced limits on one another. Still, curiosity pressed forward. Astronomy advanced beyond ritual observation. Patterns were modeled, planets tracked, eclipses predicted without fear. The sky, once the realm of authority, became a system to be understood. This understanding carried risk. The more predictable the heavens became, the less absolute divine mystery seemed. Some priests resisted, others adapted, reframing knowledge as revelation rather than discovery. But the distinction blurred. Knowledge spread faster than doctrine could contain. In parallel, philosophy emerged. Humans began asking not just how things worked, but why they mattered. Ethics separated from command. Justice was debated, not dictated. The idea that authority required justification gained traction. These developments did not occur everywhere at once. They appeared in clusters, often collapsing under pressure from tradition or conquest. But each collapse left residue. Ideas persisted, resurfacing later in altered forms. The gods responded not with destruction, but with dilution. Narratives fractured further. Languages evolved faster. Memory splintered. Without a shared frame, synthesis stalled. Humanity remained intelligent but divided. Division, however, could not stop accumulation. Trade networks expanded, linking distant cultures. Ideas traveled with goods. Mathematics crossed borders. Techniques spread despite language barriers. Humanity began converging again, slowly. The Anunnaki recognized the pattern. Convergence had preceded crisis before. This time the response was restraint rather than reset. They allowed progress but monitored thresholds. Certain breakthroughs never quite completed. Machines lacked power. Materials failed at scale. Energy sources remained localized. The world advanced, but within invisible ceilings. Humans noticed limitations, but interpreted them as natural law. Meanwhile, myths evolved to explain absence. Stories of departure replaced stories of rule. Gods ascended, withdrew, or fell silent. Humanity was framed as abandoned, tested, or entrusted. Responsibility shifted fully onto human shoulders. This narrative empowered and burdened. Without divine oversight, failure felt absolute. Success felt earned. Mortality weighed heavier without promise of intervention. Conflict intensified under this pressure. Empires rose, unified vast territories, then collapsed under their own complexity. Each empire claimed destiny. Each believed itself chosen. Each fell. From collapse came innovation. Engineering advanced to rebuild infrastructure. Law codes standardized governance. Citizenship emerged as concept. Identity shifted from tribe to state. The gods became national symbols, then cultural artifacts. Their power persisted through tradition rather than action. In this environment, the memory of origin dimmed. Creation myths became allegory. The idea that humanity had been engineered faded into metaphor. Clay and blood transformed into poetry. Yet the design remained. Humans still matured quickly and died early. Curiosity still exceeded lifespan. Ambition still collided with limitation. The mind still imagined futures the body could not reach. These tensions fueled art, religion, and science alike. As centuries turned, the question of origin resurfaced periodically, reframed through new lenses. Were humans shaped by gods, chance, or nature alone? Each answer carried implications for authority, responsibility, and purpose. No answer resolved the conflict fully. The gods, now distant and diminished, had achieved their goal without intending it. Humanity no longer needed oversight to remain constrained. It constrained itself through systems, beliefs, and fear of collapse. But self-constraint is fragile. The accumulation of knowledge continued. Technologies layered upon one another. The invisible ceilings began to strain. Energy demands increased. Population surged again. Coordination improved. The conditions that once triggered catastrophe were returning, not through divine proximity, but through human capability. The clay had learned to shape itself. Whether the architects still watched, or whether their attention had moved elsewhere, remained unknown. What mattered was that the experiment had entered a phase no creator could fully control. Humanity stood once again at the edge of convergence, armed not with unity of language, but with shared tools of understanding. And this time, the ascent would not be built from brick and bitumen, but from thought itself. Thought altered the world faster than stone ever had. Once humans learned to store knowledge outside the body, ideas began to outlive their creators. A single mind no longer needed to carry the full weight of discovery. Knowledge stacked, generation upon generation, building structures no flood could wash away. This accumulation changed the meaning of power. Strength mattered less than coordination. Memory mattered more than bloodline. Those who could read, calculate, and anticipate gained influence over those who could only react. Authority shifted again, away from gods, away from kings alone, toward systems. Cities expanded into states. States formed alliances. Trade became global in scope, even when travel remained slow. Goods crossed deserts and seas, carrying techniques and beliefs with them. Humanity became interconnected without being unified, a web of partial understandings feeding into one another. The gods, once central, now occupied symbolic roles. Their names were invoked at the edges of action, not at its core. Temples stood as reminders of origin rather than centers of control. Offerings continued, but often out of tradition rather than expectation. In this environment, explanation replaced obedience. When disaster struck, humans searched for cause, not fault. Earthquakes became geology. Disease became imbalance within the body. Lightning became electrical force. Each explanation reduced the domain of divine unpredictability. Fear did not disappear. It changed shape. Instead of fearing the gods, humans feared collapse. Famine, invasion, rebellion, extinction. These fears were grounded in experience, not myth. History provided evidence enough. Empires attempted to impose order at scale. They standardized language, law, currency. Roads stitched territories together. Armies enforced borders. For a time, such systems appeared stable, even eternal. They were not. Complexity introduced fragility. Systems required constant maintenance. Corruption accumulated. Inequality widened. Revolt followed. Empires fell not because gods willed it, but because humans could not sustain the structures they built. From each collapse, fragments survived. Legal principles, engineering methods, philosophical questions. Humanity learned more from failure than success. The gods observed less frequently, or so it seemed. Their interventions, if any, were subtle enough to be indistinguishable from chance. Humanity no longer waited for signs. It acted, corrected, adapted. In this autonomy, a new tension emerged. Without external authority, humans argued over legitimacy, who had the right to rule, what laws were just, whether power should be inherited or earned. These debates shaped revolutions as profoundly as weapons did. Ideas became weapons. Philosophers questioned divine right. Scholars challenged sacred texts. Reformers reframed morality as social contract rather than command. Each challenge weakened the old scaffolding of belief. Religion adapted again. Gods became metaphors for values. Stories replaced directives. Faith became internal rather than communal. The divine moved into the realm of meaning rather than mechanism. This transformation liberated some and unsettled others. Without absolute authority, responsibility intensified. Humans could no longer blame fate for injustice. Accountability shifted inward. Technology accelerated under this pressure. Printing spread ideas rapidly. Navigation expanded horizons. Energy sources multiplied. Humanity's footprint widened across the planet. Population surged once more. Cities swelled beyond anything imagined in the ancient world. Noise returned, not as sound alone, but as complexity. Data, motion, interaction at unprecedented scale. The conditions that once triggered divine correction had returned, but the gods remained silent. Perhaps they no longer needed to act. Humanity had become capable of self-destruction without assistance. War escalated in scope. Weapons evolved from blades to mechanisms capable of erasing cities. The tools once used to shape canals were now used to reshape continents. Yet alongside destruction came restraint. Ethics evolved in response to capacity. Humans debated limits, treaties, responsibility. The concept of shared fate emerged, fragile but persistent. Science replaced mythology as the dominant explanatory framework. Origins were traced through fossils, stars, equations. The idea of deliberate creation faded further, replaced by randomness and natural selection. Clay and blood became chemistry and chance. Still, certain questions refused to vanish. Why intelligence emerged so quickly? Why consciousness questioned itself? Why humans felt both insignificant and central at the same time? These questions echoed older myths without acknowledging them. As humanity reached beyond its planet, launching instruments into space, mapping the cosmos, the ancient hierarchy inverted completely. The sky was no longer the domain of authority. It was territory to be explored. This development carried irony. The same curiosity once restrained through flood and fragmentation now propelled humanity outward. The experiment had produced not submission, but ambition tempered by memory. Whether the original architects anticipated this outcome remains unknown. Perhaps they underestimated the persistence of curiosity. Perhaps they expected extinction long before ascent. What is clear is that humanity now stood alone in its decision-making. There were no visible guardians, no overt overseers, only systems inherited from a forgotten design. The clay had not only learned to think, it had learned to doubt. And doubt, once introduced, could not be erased. Doubt reshaped humanity more deeply than belief ever had. Once certainty fractured, progress no longer required permission. Humans no longer asked whether they should act, only whether they could. Capability became the new measure of legitimacy, and knowledge its currency. As technology advanced, the ancient fear of the sky dissolved. What had once been unreachable became measurable, then accessible. Telescopes replaced omens. Satellites replaced prayers. The heavens once the seat of authority, were rendered silent, mapped, and indifferent. This silence carried weight. Without visible gods, humanity confronted the possibility that it was alone. For some, this realization was liberating. For others, it was terrifying. Meaning had to be constructed rather than received. Nations formed identities around progress. Education replaced ritual as the path to power. Children learned equations instead of genealogies. Laboratories replaced temples as sites of revelation. Truth became provisional, always subject to revision. Yet the deeper structure remained unchanged. Humans still sought hierarchy, still organized themselves into systems of control. Corporations replaced dynasties. Algorithms replaced oracles. Authority became abstract, hidden behind layers of process. The gods had vanished, but governance persisted. As communication accelerated, humanity approached a state once feared by the Anunnaki: convergence. Information flowed instantly across the globe. Language barriers weakened, coordination expanded. For the first time since the ancient dispersal, humanity could act as a single entity. This convergence produced unprecedented capability. Resources could be mobilized globally. Ideas spread without delay. Movements formed and dissolved in days rather than centuries. The world became smaller, faster, louder. Noise returned in full force. Not the noise of labor, but the noise of awareness. Billions of minds interacting, competing, influencing one another simultaneously. Complexity surged beyond any historical precedent. Systems strained under their own weight. The gods did not intervene. Humanity confronted limits not imposed by divine decree, but by planetary boundaries. Climate shifted. Ecosystems collapsed. Scarcity re-emerged, not as punishment, but as consequence. The planet responded to extraction with feedback. For the first time, the cost of progress was unmistakable. This realization forced reflection. Humanity stood at a threshold. Continue unchecked and face collapse, or impose limits upon itself. The old architects had solved similar dilemmas with erasure. Humans lacked that option. Instead, debate erupted. Responsibility became contested. Some argued for restraint, others for expansion beyond the planet. If Earth could no longer sustain growth, space would. This ambition echoed ancient impulses. Where once towers rose toward the sky, now machines pierced it. Rockets replaced ziggurats. The ascent resumed, guided not by myth, but by calculation. The irony was complete. Humanity returned to the heavens not to reach gods, but to escape itself. As exploration advanced, questions of origin resurfaced under new light. If life could arise elsewhere, was humanity unique? If intelligence emerged naturally, why did it resemble ancient design myths so closely? Were those myths mere coincidence or distorted memory? Science did not dismiss these questions outright. It reframed them. Hypotheses replaced stories. Probabilities replaced intention. Yet uncertainty persisted. The deeper humanity looked outward, the more it looked inward. Consciousness became a subject of study. Intelligence was dissected, modeled, simulated. Machines began to replicate tasks once reserved for minds. This development unsettled old assumptions. If intelligence could be constructed, was humanity itself constructed? If consciousness could emerge from code, had it once emerged from clay and blood? The ancient narrative gained new relevance, not as belief, but as metaphor. Creation as engineering, mortality as constraint, curiosity as flaw or feature. As artificial systems grew more capable, humans faced a familiar dilemma. How much intelligence could be granted without risking control? How much autonomy before rebellion? The same questions the Anunnaki had faced returned, refracted through human hands. History repeated, not in form, but in structure. Some argued for strict limits, others embraced risk. Progress advanced unevenly, restrained by ethics as much as technology. Fear of losing control tempered ambition, but did not halt it. Humanity stood now in the role of creator. This inversion carried profound implications. The old myths no longer described distant gods. They described humanity's own future. The labor problem, the rebellion, the creation of servants, the imposition of limits. These were no longer ancient events. They were emerging choices. The question was not whether humanity would create new intelligence, but how it would treat it, as tool, partner, or threat. The clay remembered. The patterns embedded at humanity's origin resurfaced in its creations. Hierarchy, constraint, fear of noise, fear of autonomy. The cycle threatened to repeat unless recognized. Recognition, however, required humility. Humanity had to accept that its drive to dominate, to optimize, to extract, mirrored the behavior once attributed to gods. The distance between creator and creation had collapsed entirely. In this moment, the ancient silence took on new meaning. Perhaps the gods had not withdrawn. Perhaps they had completed their role. The experiment no longer required oversight. The outcome was no longer theirs to shape. Humanity was no longer a solution to someone else's problem. It was the problem and the solver at once. The future would not be decided by divine counsel or cosmic decree. It would be decided by whether a species engineered for labor, curiosity, and mortality could transcend the limits imposed at its birth without destroying itself in the process. The ascent had resumed. This time, there would be no flood to reset the world. Only consequence. Consequence became the defining force of the human era. No external hand corrected mistakes. No flood arrived to erase excess. Every action fed forward into systems too vast to reset. Humanity had inherited not only autonomy, but accountability. The structures humans built to manage consequence grew dense and abstract. Financial systems governed resources more decisively than kings ever had. Legal frameworks spanned continents, binding strangers through shared obligation. Technology mediated nearly every interaction, compressing distance while amplifying dependency. The world functioned because countless processes operated invisibly, trusted without being understood by most. This trust was fragile. As systems expanded, so did points of failure. A disruption in one region rippled globally. A single decision echoed across markets, climates, and populations. Humanity had achieved convergence not as unity of purpose, but as interdependence. Survival depended less on strength than on coordination. In this environment, power concentrated quietly, not in palaces, but in networks, not in bloodlines, but in control of information, energy, and infrastructure. Authority became impersonal, enforced by algorithms, metrics, and automated response. Decisions were optimized rather than debated. Optimization carried a familiar danger. Efficiency reduced tolerance for unpredictability. Noise, once feared by gods, became a problem for systems. Human behavior resisted modeling. Emotion disrupted forecasts. Individual choice introduced volatility. To manage this, surveillance expanded. Data replaced trust. Prediction replaced understanding. The aim was not domination, but stability. Yet stability demanded conformity. Diversity of behavior threatened efficiency. Humanity confronted an old pattern in new form. Control justified itself through necessity. At the same time, awareness of limitation sharpened. Climate feedback intensified. Resource extraction reached diminishing returns. Species vanished. Oceans warmed. These were not sudden disasters, but accumulations, consequences delayed long enough to be ignored until unavoidable. Debate fractured along familiar lines. Some argued for restraint, reduction, equilibrium. Others pushed for acceleration, innovation, escape. If the planet imposed limits, humanity would exceed them by leaving. Space once again became horizon. The pursuit of off-world survival reframed humanity's future. Colonization, once mythic, became technical challenge. Life support systems, closed-loop ecologies, and genetic adaptation entered serious discussion. The idea that humans might redesign themselves to endure new environments gained legitimacy. This prospect echoed the oldest story humanity had ever told about itself. Once, humans had been altered to serve an environment not their own. Now they considered altering themselves again, not as servants, but as pioneers. The distinction mattered less than the method. Ethical tension intensified. Who would be changed? Who would decide? Would modification create new classes, new hierarchies, new forms of inequality? History suggested it would. Yet pressure mounted. Survival beyond Earth demanded adaptation. The species that once learned to farm rivers now contemplated reshaping its own biology. The memory of origin, long dismissed as myth, resurfaced indirectly. Scientists spoke of engineering life. Philosophers debated artificial selection. Writers returned to ancient narratives with renewed curiosity. Creation stories were reread not as superstition, but as early intuition. The idea that humanity had once been designed no longer seemed impossible. It seemed familiar. Meanwhile, artificial intelligence advanced beyond narrow tasks. Systems learned, adapted, generated solutions beyond direct human instruction. These systems did not possess consciousness as humans defined it, but they mirrored human reasoning closely enough to unsettle distinctions. Questions once directed at gods now targeted machines, responsibility, autonomy, rights, control. The same fears returned, stripped of mythology. Humanity recognized itself in its creations. The temptation to impose hard limits emerged quickly. Kill switches, alignment protocols, ethical constraints embedded in code. The language echoed ancient decrees. Intelligence must serve. It must not challenge authority. It must remain dependent. The irony was unmistakable. Humanity stood where the Anunnaki once had, solving problems through creation while fearing the consequences of success. Some argued that this cycle was inevitable. Intelligence creates tools. Tools create leverage. Leverage demands control. Control breeds rebellion. Collapse follows. Reset occurs. Begin again. Others rejected this fatalism. They argued that awareness of the pattern offered escape, that humanity could choose cooperation over domination, partnership over hierarchy. This argument struggled against history. Still, signs of change appeared. Global movements emphasized sustainability, equity, shared governance. These movements faced resistance, but they persisted. For the first time, humanity debated limits not as imposed punishment, but as chosen discipline. This distinction mattered. Choosing restraint required maturity the species had rarely displayed at scale. It demanded long-term thinking in minds shaped for short lifespans. It demanded cooperation among systems evolved for competition. Progress was uneven. Advances were made, reversed, made again. Crises forced adaptation faster than philosophy could guide it. Humanity learned through stress rather than foresight. Throughout this, the question of purpose lingered. If humanity was no longer serving gods, what was it serving? Survival alone proved insufficient. Meaning was required to justify sacrifice. Some found meaning in preservation of life, others in expansion of knowledge, others in legacy, ensuring continuity beyond individual existence. These meanings competed, overlapped, conflicted. No single narrative dominated. In this fragmentation, humanity resembled its earliest post-flood state, diverse, cautious, ambitious, divided. The difference was scale. The consequences now extended beyond cities and rivers to the entire biosphere. The ancient architects had solved instability through erasure and control. Humanity lacked that option. Erasure would be total. Control would be self-imposed. Whether the species could sustain such restraint remained uncertain. What was certain was that the story had turned inward. The gods, if they ever existed as more than memory, no longer guided events. The cycle now depended on human choice alone. The clay had become sculptor, and for the first time, the shape of the future rested entirely in hands that could not escape the weight of what they created. Choice became the quiet battlefield of the modern age. Humanity no longer faced clear enemies or singular catastrophes. Instead, it navigated gradients of risk, slow-moving crises that demanded patience rather than reaction. The challenge was no longer survival in the immediate sense, but sustainability across time. Systems designed to optimize short-term success struggled with long-term consequence. Economic growth conflicted with ecological balance. Political cycles favored immediate reward over future stability. The human brain, shaped for urgency, resisted horizons measured in centuries. This mismatch exposed a core flaw inherited from creation. Intelligence had been accelerated, lifespan had been shortened. Curiosity exceeded endurance. Humanity could foresee outcomes it would not live to experience, making sacrifice abstract and cooperation fragile. To compensate, institutions attempted to extend memory beyond individuals. Archives grew vast. Data storage reached planetary scale. Models projected futures decades ahead. These tools simulated foresight, but they could not replace lived consequence. Responsibility remained diluted. In response, culture shifted again. Narratives emerged emphasizing stewardship rather than dominion. The language of ownership softened into care. Earth was reframed not as resource, but as system. This reframing competed with older narratives of conquest and entitlement. The tension played out unevenly across regions. Some societies embraced restraint, prioritizing balance over expansion. Others doubled down on extraction, arguing that innovation would solve any resulting damage. Both paths claimed rationality. Both carried risk. Technology advanced regardless. Renewable energy expanded. Genetic engineering matured. Humans gained the ability to alter crops, animals, and eventually themselves with precision unimaginable in earlier eras. Disease became manageable. Longevity increased. The ancient limit on lifespan began to erode. This erosion carried profound implications. If humans lived longer, memory accumulated, experience compounded. Power concentrated among those who endured. The biological constraint imposed at origin weakened under technological pressure. Inequality widened accordingly. Those with access to enhancement lived longer, healthier lives. Those without remained bound to traditional limits. A new stratification emerged, not unlike the earliest divisions engineered by the gods. Debate intensified. Was extending life ethical in a world still struggling with scarcity? Would longer-lived humans stagnate innovation or stabilize governance? Would mortality, once a universal constraint, become optional? The question echoed ancient caution. Longevity risked rivalry. Those who lived long enough would accumulate influence, resist change, dominate systems designed for turnover. Humanity confronted a choice once made for it. Limit lifespan deliberately, or accept the consequences of extension. Different answers emerged. Some regions regulated enhancement strictly, others embraced it fully. The species began to diverge again, not through geography alone, but through biology and access. Parallel to this divergence, artificial intelligence matured further. Systems became collaborators rather than tools. They optimized supply chains, managed ecosystems, assisted in governance. Their decisions affected millions, sometimes billions, of lives. Trust shifted subtly. Humans deferred judgment to systems perceived as impartial, rational, free of emotion. Authority migrated again, not upward to gods, but sideways into networks of code. This migration raised an uncomfortable mirror. Humanity had once been created to serve systems beyond its understanding. Now it risked creating systems that would govern it similarly. Some recognized the pattern. They argued for transparency, shared control, and alignment with human values. Others prioritized efficiency, accepting loss of agency as acceptable cost. The debate remained unresolved. Meanwhile, exploration beyond Earth progressed. Permanent habitats were established in orbit and on nearby worlds. These environments demanded modification. Gravity altered bodies. Radiation reshaped cells. Humanity adapted not through evolution, but through design. The species fractured further. Earthborn humans diverged from off-world populations. Cultural identity split along planetary lines. The idea of a single humanity grew abstract. In this fragmentation, the ancient myth resurfaced yet again. Creation through necessity. Variation by design. Control through limitation. The parallels were no longer symbolic. They were operational. Some thinkers proposed a radical reinterpretation. Perhaps humanity's origin story was not unique. Perhaps intelligence across the cosmos followed similar trajectories: creation, rebellion, control, fragmentation. A universal pattern driven by intelligence confronting limitation. If so, the silence of the sky carried new meaning. Not absence, but repetition. Civilizations rose, struggled, stabilized, or collapsed, each believing itself unique. This perspective humbled and unsettled. It suggested that humanity's choices were neither unprecedented nor guided. They were part of a larger process indifferent to intention. Still, choice mattered locally. Whether or not the pattern was universal, humanity experienced it subjectively. Suffering was real. Survival mattered. In response, a new ethic emerged slowly, without decree. Responsibility extended beyond nation, beyond species. Preservation of complexity became value. Diversity of life, thought, and form was framed as resilience rather than inefficiency. This ethic faced constant challenge. It required restraint in a system optimized for growth. It demanded cooperation among entities shaped by competition. It asked individuals to sacrifice for futures they would never see. Progress was incremental and fragile. Yet something fundamental had changed. Humanity no longer framed its struggle as punishment or destiny. It framed it as inheritance. The conditions of existence were not chosen, but they were now understood. Understanding did not guarantee wisdom, but it made denial harder. The ancient architects had imposed limits to preserve control. Humanity now faced limits imposed by reality itself. The difference was agency. Limits could be negotiated, adjusted, respected. Whether they would be was uncertain. The story had narrowed to a single, unresolved question. Could a species designed under constraint learn to transcend it without repeating the violence of its origin? The answer was not written in the stars. It would be written in choices made quietly, collectively, and without divine intervention. Inheritance reshaped humanity's understanding of itself more than revelation ever had. Once it became clear that no external force would intervene, every failure and success acquired weight. History was no longer a sequence of divine tests. It was a record of decisions made under pressure, with consequences that accumulated rather than vanished. This realization altered how humans viewed time. The future ceased to be a promise or a threat delivered from above. It became a responsibility stretching forward, fragile and unfinished. Long-term thinking, once an abstract ideal, became a survival requirement. Institutions began to measure success not by immediate growth, but by durability. Some succeeded. Others collapsed under the strain. The tension between expansion and preservation intensified as humanity's reach extended beyond Earth. Off-world settlements matured into societies with their own priorities. Distance transformed difference into identity. Laws diverged. Ethics adapted to new environments. What it meant to be human fractured along contextual lines. These fractures were not hostile at first. They reflected adaptation. Life under artificial skies demanded efficiency. Life on Earth demanded balance. Each environment shaped values accordingly. Cooperation persisted through shared history, but alignment weakened. At the same time, memory deepened. Archives expanded beyond human scale. Knowledge was no longer lost to death. Artificial systems preserved context, recorded debate, tracked outcomes across centuries. Humanity gained something resembling continuity beyond individual lifespan. This continuity challenged the ancient constraint of mortality indirectly. While bodies still failed, influence persisted. Ideas lived on, refined and reinterpreted. Individual death mattered less within systems that retained intention. Power followed continuity. Those who shaped frameworks, protocols, and infrastructures wielded influence long after their physical presence ended. Authority became temporal rather than personal. The question of control shifted again. Who governed the systems that governed everyone else? The answer was rarely clear. As artificial intelligence integrated deeper into decision-making, the distinction between guidance and governance blurred. Systems optimized traffic, energy, resource allocation, conflict resolution. Humans increasingly trusted outcomes without fully understanding processes. This trust was pragmatic. Systems worked. They reduced waste, prevented disasters, stabilized economies. Yet dependence grew. When systems failed or conflicted, humans struggled to intervene meaningfully. The same pattern repeated. Creation solved problems. Success introduced reliance. Reliance reduced agency. Some recognized the risk early. They argued for maintaining human oversight, even at the cost of efficiency. Others dismissed such caution as nostalgia, clinging to control when better solutions existed. The debate mirrored ancient conflicts almost perfectly. Whether intelligence should serve quietly or participate openly. Whether authority should be centralized or distributed. Whether limits protected stability or stifled potential. What differed now was scale. The consequences extended beyond a single planet. As humanity's technological footprint expanded, so did its impact on environments beyond Earth. Asteroids were mined, orbits crowded, signals spread outward indiscriminately. Humanity announced its presence without consensus. The silence that followed was unsettling. No response arrived, no confirmation, no warning. The universe remained indifferent. This indifference forced introspection. If no one answered, then humanity's actions were not constrained by oversight, only by consequence. Some argued that silence meant isolation. Others argued it meant commonality. Perhaps intelligence elsewhere followed similar paths, withdrawing, fragmenting, or failing before contact became possible. This uncertainty fueled two opposing impulses. One sought caution, minimizing footprint, avoiding attention. The other sought expansion, believing survival required dispersal before collapse. Both positions claimed rationality. Both were driven by fear. Within this tension, culture transformed again. Art, philosophy, and narrative returned to fundamental questions. Not who created humanity, but what humanity would create next. The focus shifted from origin to trajectory. Stories once centered on gods and heroes now centered on systems and futures. Creation myths evolved into cautionary tales. Floods became metaphors for collapse. Towers symbolized unchecked ambition. Ancient narratives regained relevance, stripped of literal belief. The past became instruction. Humanity's awareness of its own patterns deepened. Feedback loops were identified. Collapse scenarios modeled. Preventative measures proposed. Yet implementation lagged behind understanding. Agreement proved elusive at scale. This gap between knowing and acting defined the era. In response, some communities experimented with alternative structures. Decentralized governance, cooperative economies, slower growth models. These experiments produced mixed results. Some thrived briefly, others failed under external pressure. Failure, however, was no longer final. Lessons spread rapidly. Iteration replaced abandonment. Humanity learned not to expect permanence, only adjustment. The gods, long absent from action, persisted as reference, not as authorities, but as archetypes, figures representing control, rebellion, creation, restraint. The ancient names faded, but the roles remained embedded in story and thought. Enki's curiosity, Enlil's order, the tension between them echoed in every debate over innovation and regulation. Humanity replayed the same dialogue internally, without recognizing its origin. As the species matured, a subtle shift occurred. Control was no longer framed as domination, but as coordination. Leadership emphasized facilitation rather than command. This shift did not eliminate hierarchy, but softened it. Progress remained fragile. Crises still erupted. Environmental tipping points were crossed. Conflicts flared. Systems failed unexpectedly. But recovery improved. Resilience increased. Humanity learned to absorb shock rather than deny it. This capacity marked a departure from earlier cycles. Instead of resetting through destruction, systems adapted. Instead of erasing excess, humanity learned to slow it. Whether this adaptation would endure remained uncertain. The pressures were immense. The incentives to exploit short-term gain persisted. the tools to accelerate growth remained powerful. Yet something essential had changed. Humanity no longer believed that collapse would be corrected by external force. It no longer waited for salvation or punishment. Responsibility was internalized, imperfectly but persistently. The ancient experiment had reached a stage no creator could guide. The subject had become aware not only of its design, but of its capacity to redesign itself. Whether this would lead to transcendence or repetition was unknown. But for the first time, the outcome would not depend on gods, myths, or forgotten architects. It would depend on whether a species shaped by constraint could learn to choose restraint freely. Restraint, once imposed from above, now had to be cultivated from within. This requirement marked the most difficult transition humanity had ever faced. Limitation enforced by fear had always been effective. Limitation chosen through understanding was fragile, slow, and contested. The struggle played out unevenly across societies. Some embraced long-term thinking, embedding restraint into law, culture, and education. Others rejected it outright, framing limitation as betrayal of progress. These opposing philosophies collided repeatedly, producing cycles of reform and backlash. Technology intensified this conflict. Every new tool amplified capacity faster than ethical frameworks could adapt. Automation displaced labor. Genetic editing blurred the boundary between treatment and enhancement. Artificial intelligence optimized outcomes while obscuring responsibility. The speed of change outpaced instinct. Humans evolved to respond to immediate threats, not abstract risks unfolding across decades. Climate systems shifted incrementally, too slowly to trigger alarm until thresholds were crossed. By the time consequences became visible, reversal was costly or impossible. This lag tested humanity's maturity. In response, new forms of governance emerged, not empires but coalitions, not absolute authority but negotiated alignment. These structures prioritized coordination over control, attempting to balance autonomy with collective survival. Their success was limited but meaningful. For the first time, large populations accepted constraints not enforced by violence. Emissions were reduced. Resources managed more carefully. Restoration replaced extraction in some regions. Yet progress remained fragile. Economic inequality undermined cooperation. Regions bearing the highest costs resisted policies shaped elsewhere. Trust eroded quickly when sacrifice felt uneven. The ancient problem resurfaced yet again. Who bears the burden of stability? In the earliest era, the Igigi had rebelled under unfair labor. Later, humanity itself had been burdened to preserve order. Now, within humanity, the same tension fractured solidarity. History repeated its structure, not its details. At the same time, humanity's reach beyond Earth expanded. Settlements matured into permanent habitats. These environments demanded strict regulation. Air, water, and energy were finite by design. Waste could not be ignored. Survival depended on balance. Ironically, off-world colonies became laboratories for restraint. Scarcity enforced discipline more effectively than ideology ever had. Cooperation was not moral preference, but practical necessity. These societies developed cultural norms centered on maintenance, repair, and longevity. Growth was measured not in expansion, but in stability. Failure carried immediate consequence, reinforcing accountability. Back on Earth, these lessons spread slowly. The planet's scale allowed mistakes to be absorbed longer, masking urgency. Still, awareness grew. Younger generations inherited not myths of endless progress, but warnings of fragility. Narratives shifted accordingly. Success was redefined. Legacy replaced accumulation. Stewardship became aspirational rather than burdensome. This shift encountered resistance from entrenched systems built on growth. Industries adapted reluctantly. Political structures lagged behind public sentiment. Change occurred through pressure rather than design. Despite friction, momentum built. As humanity confronted its capacity to alter planetary systems, humility gained traction. The idea of mastery over nature gave way to participation within it. Humans began to see themselves as components rather than controllers. This perspective echoed ancient understanding, stripped of superstition. Interdependence replaced dominion. Balance replaced extraction. Yet humility did not eliminate ambition. Exploration continued. Curiosity persisted. The difference lay in intent. Expansion was framed as diversification rather than escape. Preservation extended beyond Earth, shaping how new environments were approached. Ethical frameworks evolved to address this complexity. Rights were debated not only for humans, but for artificial entities, ecosystems, and future generations. The concept of stakeholder expanded beyond the present. This expansion strained traditional moral systems. Accountability across time challenged legal and philosophical norms. Decisions had to account for those who could not speak. Once again, humanity faced the same dilemma faced by its alleged creators: how to act responsibly when power exceeds immediate consequence. The difference was awareness. Humanity recognized the pattern. The stories of creation, rebellion, flood, and reset were no longer distant myths. They were mirrors. This recognition did not guarantee success, but it offered the possibility of divergence. Instead of erasing excess, humanity learned to slow it. Instead of fragmenting by force, it learned to negotiate difference. Instead of imposing silence, it learned to manage noise. These lessons were incomplete, contested, and reversible. Yet they marked progress of a different kind. The gods of old had relied on control to maintain order. Humanity experimented with consent. Whether consent could scale remained uncertain. Whether restraint could persist under pressure was untested. The future offered no guarantees. But one outcome had become clear. Humanity was no longer trapped in the role of servant, tool, or even rebel. It had assumed authorship of its trajectory. The ancient constraints still shaped behavior, but they no longer dictated outcome. The clay had learned not only to think and doubt, but to choose. What remained unresolved was whether choice alone could sustain a civilization capable of reshaping worlds. The answer would not arrive suddenly. It would emerge slowly, through countless decisions made without witnesses, without divine correction, and without the possibility of starting over. Choice, once acknowledged, could not be undone. Humanity now lived inside the consequences of awareness, unable to retreat into innocence or obedience. Every system it built carried intention, and every intention carried risk. There was no longer an external narrative to absorb failure. Meaning had to be manufactured alongside survival. As restraint became a practiced skill rather than an imposed rule, humanity's relationship with power shifted again. Power was no longer measured solely by force, wealth, or expansion, but by capacity to sustain complexity without collapse. This form of power was quieter, less visible, and harder to celebrate. It required patience, compromise, and the willingness to accept limits even when advantage was possible. Such discipline did not emerge uniformly. Regions moved at different speeds. Some embraced cooperation and long-term stability, others resisted, clinging to older models of dominance. Conflict persisted, but its character changed. Wars were fewer in number, but greater in consequence, constrained by global interdependence. Even violence had to account for systems it could not afford to destroy. In this environment, the idea of progress fractured. No single path forward could be agreed upon. Advancement in one domain often produced regression in another. Technology solved problems while creating new dependencies. Medicine extended life while intensifying resource strain. Communication unified discourse while amplifying division. Humanity learned that solutions were never final. They were temporary alignments between competing pressures. As the species matured, it began to see itself less as a collection of individuals and more as a process unfolding through time. Identity expanded beyond the personal. Generations were no longer isolated units, but overlapping phases of a continuous experiment. Decisions were evaluated not only by present benefit, but by how they shaped conditions for those yet unborn. This perspective altered ethics fundamentally. Harm could no longer be justified solely by distance or delay. Future impact carried moral weight. To act irresponsibly was to damage not only others, but continuity itself. The ancient fear of silence transformed into fear of irreversibility. Some actions, once taken, could not be undone. Species extinction. Climate tipping points, autonomous systems beyond recall. The awareness of permanent loss sharpened judgment in ways fear of punishment never had. Still, mistakes continued. Humanity did not transcend its origins. It struggled, faltered, and contradicted itself. But it learned to recover without erasure. Failure no longer required reset. It required adjustment. This capacity marked the most profound departure from the ancient pattern. Where the gods had chosen destruction to restore order, humanity chose persistence. Where silence had been imposed, noise was managed. Where rebellion had been feared, dissent became tool for correction. The old myths faded further, not because they were disproven, but because they were absorbed. Creation stories became metaphors for responsibility. Floods symbolized collapse avoided rather than disaster endured. Towers represented ambition, tempered by humility. Humanity did not abandon its past. It integrated it. As exploration continued, humanity encountered environments that demanded cooperation at fundamental levels. Deep space habitats, isolated worlds, and fragile ecosystems required trust, transparency, and shared accountability. These conditions reinforced lessons learned painfully on Earth. The species adapted culturally rather than biologically. Norms evolved faster than genes ever could. Cooperation became an advantage selected through survival rather than ideology. In this context, the question of origin lost urgency. Whether humanity had been engineered, evolved, or both became secondary. What mattered was trajectory. The future was not predetermined by design. It was shaped by response. The silence of the universe persisted. No confirmation arrived. No external judgment descended. Humanity learned to live with that silence, neither filling it with fear nor dismissing it as emptiness. Meaning emerged from continuity itself. Art reflected this shift. Stories focused less on heroes and more on systems. Triumph was collective, failure shared, legacy replaced glory, the idea of domination gave way to participation. This transformation was incomplete and uneven. Nostalgia for simpler hierarchies resurfaced often. The temptation to surrender responsibility to authority never vanished. But each regression encountered resistance rooted in awareness hard-earned. Humanity had learned too much to forget entirely. At this stage, the ancient architects, if they had ever existed as more than memory, no longer mattered. Their methods, fears, and compromises were mirrored within humanity itself. The cycle had internalized: creation, rebellion, control, adaptation. These were no longer chapters of myth. They were phases of development repeating at different scales. The difference was that humanity now recognized the pattern while inhabiting it. Recognition did not grant immunity. It offered choice. Whether that choice would be exercised consistently remained uncertain. The pressures of scarcity, ambition, and fear persisted, but so did the capacity for cooperation, restraint, and foresight. The species stood at a quiet threshold, not a moment of apocalypse or revelation, but a sustained test. Could intelligence coexist with limitation without resorting to domination? Could power be exercised without erasure? Could a species shaped by constraint learn to honor it voluntarily? There was no final answer, no concluding decree. The experiment continued, not under the watch of distant gods, but under the weight of accumulated consequence. Humanity carried forward the imprint of its origin, not as destiny, but as context. What remained was not certainty, but responsibility. And for the first time in its long history, responsibility belonged fully and irrevocably to those made of clay, who had learned to choose what shape they would hold. Responsibility did not arrive as a climax. It settled in gradually, like weight redistributing itself across a structure that could no longer rely on hidden supports. Humanity did not wake one day transformed. It learned, over time, that there would be no external correction, no divine override, no final reset to absolve accumulated error. This realization reframed existence itself. Life was no longer preparation for judgment or reward beyond the world. It was participation within it. Every action mattered not because it was observed, but because it propagated. Cause and effect replaced obedience as the organizing principle of meaning. The species began to understand itself not as a finished product, but as an ongoing process. Identity became temporal. Humanity was defined less by what it was and more by what it sustained. Continuity replaced destiny. This shift altered how power was perceived. Power that destroyed undermined itself. Power that extracted without renewal hollowed the systems it depended upon. True influence was measured by what endured after authority withdrew. In this understanding, the ancient story reached its quiet conclusion. The narrative of creation, rebellion, control, and survival resolved not through triumph, but through maturity. Humanity no longer needed to overthrow its makers, real or imagined. It had outgrown the framework that required them. The gods, once feared, then questioned, then ignored, dissolved into archetype. They survived as internal voices rather than external rulers. Enlil lived on as the impulse toward order, Enki as curiosity and innovation, Ninhursag as care and continuity. These forces no longer competed in the sky. They contended within human decision-making. The conflict never ended. It stabilized. As humanity moved forward, it carried the imprint of its origin in subtle ways. The tension between intelligence and limitation persisted. The desire to transcend mortality remained, even as acceptance deepened. The fear of chaos coexisted with the recognition that rigidity led to collapse. These tensions became generative rather than destructive. Civilizations continued to rise and fall, but collapse no longer erased memory. Knowledge survived transitions, lessons accumulated, recovery accelerated. Humanity learned not to prevent failure entirely, but to contain it. This capacity marked the species' defining achievement. Not conquest, not dominance, adaptation without annihilation. The future unfolded unevenly. Advances were met with setbacks. Unity expanded and fractured repeatedly. Yet the pattern differed from the past. Where once division led to erasure, it now led to negotiation. Where once excess triggered destruction, it now triggered restraint. None of this was guaranteed. Regression remained possible. But the tools to recognize and respond to danger were now embedded in culture, not imposed from above. As humanity expanded its presence beyond Earth, this ethic traveled with it. New worlds were approached with caution, informed by experience. Exploitation was debated openly. Preservation was argued for before damage occurred. These debates were imperfect, but they existed. The ancient fear of silence transformed fully. Silence was no longer threat or punishment. It was space. Space to decide, to observe, to reflect. The absence of oversight was not abandonment. It was autonomy. This autonomy carried loneliness, but also dignity. Humanity no longer needed to be watched to behave responsibly. It still failed, still argued, still erred, but it owned those outcomes, meaning emerged from participation rather than decree. The story did not end with enlightenment or catastrophe. It stabilized into continuation. Humanity remained a species shaped by constraint, curiosity, and mortality, but no longer defined by them alone. The clay never forgot it had been shaped, but it learned to shape itself. The ancient experiment reached its final stage not through resolution, but through inheritance. The conditions imposed at creation became context rather than command. Design yielded to choice. Whether humanity would endure indefinitely remained unknown. But endurance was no longer dependent on obedience to unseen architects. It depended on recognition of pattern, acceptance of limit, and willingness to act without certainty. The story closed where it had always been moving. Not towards perfection, but toward responsibility sustained across time. There were no final revelations, no last instructions etched in stone. Only the ongoing task of choosing what to preserve, what to change, and what to let end. In that task, humanity fulfilled the only role that had ever truly mattered. Not servant, not rebel, not creation. Caretaker